honored to have Karen MacInnis as our speaker, and she's going to talk about the collection of samplers that we have here at the Marblehead Museum. Our collection of samplers and needlework is exceptional, and these pieces made by girls and young women are works that have much to tell the viewer about their maker's skills and the life and times in which they made them. Karen MacInnis has studied these and other needlework pieces and is knowledgeable about their importance. Our curator, Karen, is an exceptional member of our staff and contributes to the care and management of the collection in many ways. Karen has lent her expertise to the Marblehead Museum as well as to other institutions. She has consulted at the Lynn Museum, at the Wenham Museum, and at the Peabody Essex Museum, and has contributed to needlepoint surveys. She also has given her talents to other institutions. She's the vice president of the board of the Bellingham Carey House, which is a wonderful historic house museum in Chelsea, and she's also a trustee of the Salisbury Library. It's my great pleasure to introduce Karen, to welcome her to the podium, even though I welcome her to our workspace here every day. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Pam.
You're welcome.
And yes, thank you all for coming. I have the sheets of paper and the backup, just in case. And I'm learning to use the clickers, so let us see. I'll stand it up. Yeah, that's fine, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Many of the photographs used tonight in tonight's presentation were taken by our own Marcia Hunkins. She's been involved with us here at the Marblehead Museum and Historical Society for many years, and her spirit and meticulous attention to detail are very much appreciated. This is one of the photographs that Marcia took, pardon me, and this is actually a piece of an 18th century men's vest or waistcoat, and what looks like black shiny stuff is silver wrapped silk thread, so it's black because it has tarnished. Tonight's lecture is the singular style of Marblehead samplers. Remarkable survivals. Generally speaking, higher education for the female segment of the population was not until relatively recently considered to be of particular importance. However, throughout history, most societies have traditionally placed a high value on females being proficient with a needle and thread, regardless of their economic status within the community. These expectations share a surprising commonality and represent a broader historical view of cultures that are separated by geography, religion, and traditions. So, bearing that in mind tonight, I ask you to see a wider view of this art form, rather than simply seeing an ordered display of rectangular pieces of cloth covered with little X's, swirls, and images sewn with colored bits of thread. I would ask you to see their importance within the broader scope of art, of education, and connections with people from all over the globe over the period of many centuries. Textiles are extremely vulnerable to damage and decay. Environmental causes such as exposure to sunlight, as well as extremes in temperature and relative humidity, can cause irreversible damage to the fibers. The samplers in art viewed tonight have linen or silk as a ground or base fabric, with silk floss used as the embroidered embellishment. They represent remarkable survivals of what can be accomplished with needle and thread. The museum is very fortunate to own over 50 samplers and embroideries. A number of them are made of a dark black, green, linsey-woolsey ground fabric that was predominantly used during the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the coastal towns north of Boston and into southern New Hampshire. The samplers in our collection that include the date of completion and the creator's name range from 1764 to 1856. This 92-year span represents a formidable compilation of art, regardless of the medium used. They give an indication of the stylistic changes that occurred in the Marblehead area, beginning from the period of our country's growth as a flourishing English colony, through our early years as a republic, incredible surges of expansion, and into the middle of the 19th century. Also notable is the age span of the artist, from young girls to mature women. The known ages of the girls in the Marblehead Museum sampler collection ranges from 8 years old to 20 years old, and in many instances show an attention to detail and a capacity for exquisite workmanship far beyond the scope of their years. Most of the embroideries in our collection were made right here in Marblehead. Many of them have been gifts from the daughters or descendants of the creators. A number of the donors no longer lived here in town, but they wanted the piece to remain within the town in which it was created. The museum is indeed grateful to them for all of their time spent plying their needles, for their individuality, their love of beauty, and for ensuring that others may continue to enjoy these Marblehead treasures. One of the most important publications ever written about the American art form of embroidery is Girlhood Embroidery, American Samplers and Pictorial Needlework, 1650 to 1850, written by Betty Ring and published in 1993. Mrs. Ring's monumental 2-volume work garnered such comments as the following: inarguably the ultimate publication of its genre. No student of earlier life in the United States, whether concerned with craft, pictorial, education, familial, or feminist issues, can afford to ignore Ring's stupendous achievement. The importance of Marblehead's stylistic contributions within the larger picture merited its own section in Girlhood Embroidery, titled Marblehead, Its Magnificent Samplers, and Eminent Schoolmistress. Comments such as incomparable, one of the most spectacular recognizable groups of New England needlework, serve to help us see the unexpected mastery of stitches and designs presented in a joyous and idiosyncratic manner. And as further evidence of Mrs. Ring's scholarship and intelligence on this subject, our own Betty Hunt, or the Betty Hunt, as I always refer to her as, is thanked in Mrs. Ring's acknowledgement for her, quote, exceptional help, end quote. So, what is the Marblehead style? Reverend William Bentley, Salem minister and diarist, made note of his disdain, shall we say, for Marblehead, and the independent nature of its inhabitants in his entry for January 1st, 1806, when he wrote about that singular freedom of speaking and acting that characterizes Marblehead. It's kind of nice to know that things really don't change 200 years later. Marbleheaders are indeed singular. It isn't only those whose ancestors have been here for generations or those who were born within the town limits. It also isn't the people who have chosen to live here or, like myself, have visited and loved Marblehead over the period of a lifetime. There's just something different and special about Marblehead. And that fact has its effect on its inhabitants, on what they do and how they do it. They know and care about the world at large, but often their view is one of independent thought and independent action. They take the world's offerings and give them a slight twist. So it is with the Marblehead style of girlhood embroideries created here in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The pattern of stitches and the fashionable clothing of the day are seen, but often have an idiosyncratic flourish. So fun. Here we are. This is all very charming, but what is a sampler? The word sampler is derived from the French exemplaire and the Latin exemplum, meaning a kind of model or pattern to work by, copy, or imitate. Samplers are generally grouped as two basic types, a memory type or a display type. A memory sampler is a length of linen upon which a young woman would work a variety of stitches. Adding to it as she learned a new pattern, the piece would remain unframed and stored away to be taken out and used as a reference tool throughout the woman's lifetime, whenever it was needed. A display sampler, or an accomplishment sampler, was one that indicated a girl's accomplishment and refinement, a reflected glory that showed her family had the means to educate their daughter in the finer things of life. It would be framed and placed in a highly visible and public position in the house for all to admire and comment upon, a trophy, if you will. In order to fully appreciate these fragile pieces of art, we really must explore the world in which they were created. The recorded history of this type of creativity began over 500 years ago. Most of the samplers, our samplers, were created in a European, particularly English tradition and style. Indeed, the first reference to a sampler was written in the account book of Elizabeth of York on July 10, 1502. At the time, Elizabeth was Queen of England, and she and her husband, Henry VII, were parents of Henry VIII. He of the Six Wives, which we all know Henry VIII and the Six Wives. Her account book, his mother's account book, Elizabeth, recorded a payment for an L, or about 45 inches long, of linen cloth for a sampler for the Queen. Whether or not the linen was intended for the Queen's use or for a member of her household staff isn't clear, but the cost of the linen was listed with her budget for the year. The use of embroidery to add decoration to household textiles and clothing became so stylish and increased in popularity to such a great extent that its use grew to become more widespread and available to more and more of the general population, not just the wealthier few. Indeed, by the first third of the 17th century, during the reign of the English King Charles I, the use of embroidering spot samplers, or samplers with a variety of patterns and symbols, had become so much a part of everyday life that the use of samplers as a teaching tool had become a well-established component of many schools' curriculum. Using samplers as a rote method of learning, tutors in small private schools taught girls the repetition of stitches in established patterns, counting the threads up and down to determine the placement of the stitched designs required patience, discipline, and following instructions, all of which are part of the learning process. In Europe, and then later in the American colonies, girls as early as age 5 or 6 were taught the simple cross-stitched X design that was used in marking household textiles with letters and numbers. Even when a woman's economic status gave her the choice of whether or not she would do the actual stitching, she was still expected to know how to do the work. Indeed, she bore the additional responsibility of seeing that all of the female members within her household, family and servants alike, were trained in plain and fancy needlework. The English folkways, societal structure, and traditions were carried to the New World in the beginning of the 17th century. The value placed on needlework also was continued in these newly settled communities. In New England, a large percentage of the immigrants were known to one another because they were related either through blood or by marriage, or they were groups of people from towns in England who were encouraged to immigrate by others from the same area. The hierarchies that had been established in Old England often remained in these new marginal settlements of New England, and the predominantly Protestant, often Puritan, government and church held a powerful influence upon the lives of these people. Indeed, the author Nathaniel Hawthorne used embroidery almost as a separate entity in his novel, The Scarlet Letter. When the character Hester Prynne is named as an adulteress, she must wear a letter A on the front of her dress as a visual reminder to herself and the community of the enormity of her sin. Defiantly, she creates a masterpiece of needle art. I quote, "On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy that it had all the effect of a last and fitting decoration to the apparel of which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony." End quote. This was a society in which you were expected to know your place and your relationship to others. Responsibility to one's family, town, and the well-being of society in general was paramount. All were expected to contribute. Children particularly were to do what God, parents, ministers, etc. told them to do. And a basic level of education was deemed important to achieve this goal by training the mind and training the body to be useful, always industrious, and never idle. The unit of family and the extension of this unit within each town meant that all were to exhibit discipline and diligence toward the success of the town and be active contributors toward the survival of the group. An ordered society prevented a barrier between that which was known from the chaos of that which was unknown. These framed testaments to refinement and beauty were not just seen in the houses of the upper classes, but in the homes whose income were above a certain middle income level. Farmers, yeomen, merchants, ship owners, captains, and shipmasters all had the responsibility to ensure that their daughters had marriageable skills, and expertise with the needle was expected of all women. Families who had the means educated their girls at local boarding or day schools. Others sent their girls to neighborhood dame schools. Again, most education for females was not considered a priority for the government. However, education at a basic level was expected. After the Revolution, new sentiments were embroidered along with the standard moral injunctions. The text on one of our samplers reads, "Betty Leach is my name, New England is my nation. Marblehead is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation." They now proclaimed the sense of belonging to a new region, a new country, a new beginning. Visions of a new republic expressed in lofty verses declared a membership in a new world order. During the 18th century, the tradition of embroidering samplers for reference and as an accomplishment remained an integral part of a girl's education, and while the fashions of Europe retained their cachet with the colonists, a less rigid and, shall we say, more fluid artistic style took shape in the New World. Naturally, the spirit took a somewhat over-the-top style in Marblehead and continued into the first quarter of the 19th century. This is what shouts Marblehead to students of textile history, the spirit of optimism in the new nation, as well as the climate of their town. A three-sided meandering border was frequently used in different towns in the states. Sometimes it would have an area at the bottom with densely packed rows of stitching meant to represent a grassy hill or a lawn. This border was either strictly angular or was curved in gracefully arched tendrils, but a certain group of samplers made in Marblehead exhibit what seemed to be super blossoms and large arched bowers with fantastical birds perched in the treetops. Individual interpretation of current fashions are to be expected, but What are these exuberant displays of ducks and flowers springing up out of large pots? Men's fashions, too, were included in these samplers as well. The gentlemen often are shown removing their hats, sometimes not, is the gentleman in the middle. And changing styles are followed as closely as the ladies. The fashionable attire of the day is illustrated in fashion plates from the late 18th century. These are actually models of authentic 18th century clothing at the Victoria and Albert in London on either side. And they're from the late 18th century along with the elegant posturing, but what tall floral arrangement is perched on top of this woman's head? The two ladies in the fashion illustrations have large muffs resembling beehives. Is that what the young lady from Marblehead has in her arms? This mannequin dressed in late 18th century clothing is holding a book in her hands. Also in this image is the embroidered young lady from the last slide. But what kind of large fruit or blossom is she harvesting with her companion? This fashionable young lady is holding an equally fashionable parasol or sunshade. The mannequins dressed in period clothing also echo her striped shirt and plain petticoat. Women's fashionable headgear during the early 19th century included various forms of turbans and sprigs of feathers. Again, Marblehead followed the trend but gave it an individual twist of its own with a turban, feathers, and a parasol. These samplers began to be created in the 1780s when the aftermath of the American Revolution resulted in economic hardships, and they are attributed to the eminent schoolmistress of Marblehead, Martha Tarr Hanover Barber, who was baptized in Marblehead on March 2nd, 1735. Martha was widowed twice and was described by a contemporary as an eminent schoolmistress for many years upon her death at age 77 on January 23rd, 1812. One of her daughters, Miriam Barber, continued their school until her own death in 1830. She too is noted by a contemporary as a noted schoolmistress. While only circumstantial evidence points to the influence of these two women, little or nothing is known of any other schoolmistress in Marblehead who had such a stylistic impact. Well, what kind of life did these students lead after they embroidered these pieces of cloth? How many others were taught a particular style of embroidery and learned their letters at the Sarah Stivers School in Salem, Mary and Miriam Barber School in Marblehead, or at a number of as yet unknown, yet identified local schools with a talented schoolmistress? The 19th century saw the world change to an almost unimaginable degree. The large-scale use of machines created the idea of mass production. Some people took advantage of dizzying, brilliant opportunities, while others lived under horrific working conditions and large-scale, mind-numbing poverty. For many needlework scholars, the golden age of samplers ends by the 1840s. Undoubtedly, the inevitable change in stylistic preferences played a role. The increasingly large number of children in publicly and privately funded schools also fostered teaching only basic stitching skills. The basic X stitch or cross stitch was sometimes now the only type of stitch used on samplers. The diverse nature of our collection can be seen in some of our other pieces, most of which are from Marblehead. One of my personal favorites is this sampler. It's downstairs in the display case. I love odd juxtapositions, and it's not fancy. It's something you go, yeah, okay, fine, whatever, and move on. It's called The Spies of Canaan, or The Grapes of Esau, and it was done by Tamsin Brown of Marblehead around 1795. There were 3 Tamsin Browns living in Marblehead at that time. One of her descendants, a Miss Tamsin Brown Harris, left it to us in her will. While initially it appears to be just a simple design, it represents a powerful story from the Bible's Old Testament book of Numbers. The Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan." So Moses sent them from the wilderness to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, "Be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes, and they came to the valley of Eshcol, and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between 2 of them. God had promised them that they would be protected from harm. But except for Caleb and Joshua, everyone was fearful of going into the new land because they were afraid of having to fight the people who already lived there. Angry at their reluctance and inability to believe in his power, God said, "No one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make dwell, except Caleb and Joshua." So, not only was there teaching and discipline involved in working the sampler, it also reinforced to the child, do what God tells you. Do what your parents tell you. Do what your teacher tells you to do. Another seemingly plain example is a genealogical register type of sampler that was created by Betsy Leach of Marblehead in 1789. The once vibrant colors of the silk embroidery threads have faded through exposure to sunlight and also through the sometimes unstable nature of some of the dyes. At first glance, it's a large sampler, somewhat plain and boring, with an unremarkable, 3-sided, very angular, meandering border with what appears to be line after line of faded letters and numbers just marching across the linen. But upon closer inspection, a creative, somewhat whimsical personality emerges when you become aware of the multicolored birds perched on branches and fruit. I'm going to back up one moment, and you can see the harlequin birds with the red tops right at the very top of the sampler. And then about halfway down the slide, there are the frieze of birds with the black. And now they're simply reversed in this slide. And finally, a deep sense of piety can be felt if you consider that it may be a communion chalice near the bottom left. And perhaps that odd animal on the right is meant to represent Christ as the Lamb of God. Another sampler provided a research experience that I like to refer to as fun with science. It had been folded, and the section that contained the girl's name, age, and date of completion was damaged. It's down in that bottom area above the waves. Consequently, we had to list the maker as unknown. This really bothered me, as it was an unusual and interesting sampler, and I wanted to give credit to the person who had created it. Scanning it, putting the image into Photoshop, making the image light, dark, changing the background colors, looking at it under a magnifying glass, nothing worked. Then a possibility occurred to me. Would using a different light spectrum, such as a black light, fluoresce some of the dyes used in the silk embroidery floss and make them stand out? Yes, it did. I was able to determine that a Miss Rebecca B. Micklefield, aged 14, had made this in 1812. She was born in Boston in 1798, pardon me. Her family moved to Salem, where her father was a tobacconist and mill owner, and they alternatively lived in Marblehead and Salem. She never married and was last listed as being a resident of Salem in the federal census of 1860. She died at age 67 of heart disease on August 24, 1866. On the right is a scan of the graph and the sampler that I am in the process of copying out and doing her work. I think that she would be pleased to know that nearly 200 years after she created this piece, her time and effort are again being appreciated. I know that it gave me a great deal of satisfaction to remove unknown from our computer database and replace it with Rebecca B. Micklefield. In one instance, the depth of our collection here allows us the incredible opportunity to own a sampler created by a young woman of 11, a painting of her as a mature married woman, and an image of her as an older woman seated with her son Edward. Here is the sampler of Margaret Oliver Woods, created when she was 11 years old. She was born and raised in Andover. Her father and brother were both ministers. She married Reverend Edward A. Lawrence, and their only son also became a minister. She and her husband were social activists. They traveled to Geneva, Switzerland in the 1850s to attend an international peace conference. Margaret wrote a number of books and articles using the pen name of Metta Lander. Edward and Margaret moved to Marblehead when he was the pastor of the Old North Church from 1845 to 1854. They had at least 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, 2 of whom were born in Marblehead. One of their daughters died just prior to her 4th birthday. The Lawrence family moved to Connecticut for a few years and then moved back to Marblehead, where they lived just up the hill at 185 Washington Street. They loved living in Marblehead and referred to their house as Linden Home. Margaret remained here until her husband's death and her own death in 1901. Their remaining daughter donated her parents' portraits, her mother's sampler, and 5 other objects to us at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, I see these samplers as very personal, even intimate items. Think about it. Think about the hours and the weeks that are required to create each one of these embroideries. Perhaps the unfinished piece was shoved into a pocket or cloth bag and later either dragged out to stab a few more foolish stitches into the cloth, or perhaps it was pulled out with pride to have an adult comment on the wonderful progress being made. These pieces of fabric were held in the girls' laps. They were handled by themselves and family members, and they were expected. They were really expected to be placed in a place of honor in their homes. These are important objects, certificates of accomplishment. So, in a broader sense, these fragile reminders of the past represent not just an examination of simple embroideries created by young girls of the 18th and 19th centuries, but is part of the education of female children over many generations. I ask you to reflect on the fact that these samplers are not just pretty things. They were very personal possessions that were meant to be important training and teaching tools. The legacy of this discipline is important because the effects upon the young girl who created the sampler were often far-reaching. The concepts inculcated into these young girls' minds were powerful and lofty goals that they were expected to reach. Obviously, some of the girls never reached adulthood. Certainly, some of the girls didn't follow the established rules of society and went their own paths. But regardless of their later direction and station in life, the lessons learned were still part of their own memories and still affected them in adulthood. These concepts, in turn, would often influence later generations of children, male and female, either within a family or in an educational setting. Everyone wants to have a choice, even if that choice is A and B, neither of which is very appealing. It is at least a choice. I like to think that the girls who embroidered these samplers had a choice of design, that they had a choice of the verse. It's clearly evident to even the most casual of observer that some of them did not want to do their needlework, whether they would have preferred to be running around outside or curled up somewhere reading a book. They found very little joy in counting threads and sticking a needle with colored threads in and out of a piece of fabric in order to make a design. Other girls obviously had a gift of design, an eye for color, and a capacity for exquisite workmanship. To me, in a sense, it's a way of honoring them. It's a way for us to continue to hear their voices. And that is what keeps history alive. The past is relevant. Whether or not we wish it to be so, the past is the foundation of who we are, what we represent, and what we wish to leave behind as a legacy. Every object in a museum's collection gives us the opportunity to learn why an object was created and by whom. What use did the object serve? Why did it survive? And what can it tell us about those that used it? Personally, I find it very humbling to study these fragile masterpieces. Due to the need to protect them from light, they are rarely on display. I hope that you will look at some of the ones that we've brought out for you tonight and enjoy them. And I hope that you've enjoyed seeing some of them in greater detail and hearing about the lives of some of the young women who created them. Thank you very much. Welcome to go about, and we have some samplers here, or I'll stop talking.
I have one question. You mentioned the medium that they printed on. That was more consistent in the North Shore. Why was that?
Well, we don't know. But I mean, if you're anybody that knows anything about samplers, even just a rudimentary knowledge of samplers, if you see a dark brown, you go, North Shore. And it's just north of Boston, Essex County, hugging the coast, and a few cases in southern New Hampshire, but only up, well, of course there's not that much of coastal New Hampshire anyway. But it was just a design choice. Again, it could have been influenced by certain schoolmistresses, or you saw it and you lived in Linfield and then you came back to Salem and said, oh, I want that. It's the same thing, fashion, we don't know.
It wasn't just a textile that was available.
No, it was a design choice.
Huh.
The silk was what was available, but no, it was just a design choice.